Everywhere in history, you will find it. Men and women who could not breathe without an enemy to fight. Families, religions, nations, all built on the need for someone to oppose, to blame, someone to destroy. But why? Why does the human soul so often demand an enemy in order to feel alive? What I am about to reveal is not comfortable. It is a forbidden truth, hidden in the shadow of psychology, where Carl Jung once walked. If you stay with me, you will understand why some people cannot survive without inventing an enemy, and why this truth should terrify you. There is a silence that falls over humanity whenever it runs out of enemies. It is not peace. It is not harmony. It is suffocation. For some people, and at times for entire civilizations, the absence of an enemy feels like death itself. They need someone to hate, someone to fear, someone to oppose. Without it, their identity unravels. History proves this with brutal clarity. When wars end, when revolutions succeed, when oppressors fall, the victors do not rest. They search frantically for the next adversary, the next scapegoat, the next shadow to throw stones at. The enemy is oxygen, and without it, they cannot breathe. I remember a patient who embodied this hunger perfectly, a man admired for his discipline, his order, his sense of morality. On the surface, he was a devoted father, a loyal husband, a respected worker. But in my office, his words dripped with venom for anyone he perceived as corrupt or weak. His neighbors, his colleagues, sometimes even his own children, he turned them all into enemies in his mind. Without conflict, he grew restless, as though swallowed by emptiness. His life was not defined by who he was, but by who he opposed. His unconscious revealed this more starkly. In dreams, he fought endless battles, faceless opponents, hordes of shadows. Victory never came. Only the endless rush of combat. Modern science calls this enemy addiction. Psychologists studying identity politics and tribalism note that the human brain craves boundaries between us and them. Research from Princeton and Harvard shows that dopamine surges not only when we experience joy, but also when we witness the suffering of those we perceive as enemies. The brain rewards hostility because it gives us meaning. Neuroscience now tells us what myth has always known. For many, survival requires the presence of an enemy. Without it, the self collapses into confusion. The ancients encoded this knowledge in their myths. In the Bible, the Israelites wander aimlessly when they no longer have enemies to fight, turning against one another in despair. In Greek mythology, Achilles is inconceivable without Hector. His identity requires the enemy. In Norse prophecy, Ragnarok itself is not a punishment, but the final battle, because even the gods cannot imagine existence without enemies to confront. In Buddhist texts, the illusion of separation creates the cycle of samsara, binding beings to endless conflict. From scripture to myth, the message is the same. Human beings are terrified of a life. The signs of this hunger are subtle but deadly. The friend who grows uneasy when life feels too calm, seeking arguments over trivial matters. The community leader who always warns of hidden dangers, stirring fear to justify his authority. The family member who cannot forgive, who reopens old wounds to keep hatred alive. These are not quirks. They are the whisper of a deeper truth. Without enemies, they are. The stages unfold predictably. First, they define themselves through goodness, law, or faith. Second, they seek contrast, someone to embody what they reject. Third, they inflate, convincing themselves that the enemy is not only wrong, but evil. Fourth, they erupt, attacking, condemning, destroying, finally collapse. When the enemy is gone, they feel hollow, desperate, and search for another to fill the void. This cycle is not accident. It is design, an archetypal hunger that Jung described as projection of the shadow. What they cannot face within themselves, they hunt in others. When expanded to the collective, the danger becomes apocalyptic. Nations without enemies invent them. Political movements without opposition turn inward, devouring themselves in purges and betrayals. Religions, once secure, fracture into sects, each declaring the other. Humanity, as a whole, seems addicted to the theater of conflict, And in this addiction it justifies rivers of blood, convinced that survival depends on annihilation of the other. The protocol of survival is not easy. To resist the hunger for enemies, one must embrace the unbearable, the realization that the enemy is within. The rage, the envy, the cruelty we project onto others are fragments of our own denied soul. Jung warned that the one who looks outside dreams, the one who looks inside awakens. But to awaken is terrifying, for it means the battle is not against them, it is against ourselves. Here is the truth you must carry. If you meet a man who cannot live without enemies, you are looking at a soul terrified of its own shadow, and if you follow him, you will inherit his war. For the greatest danger is not the enemy before us, but the void within us that demands an enemy. Every enemy is a mirror. This is the truth most people refuse to. When a man curses his rival, when a nation demonizes outsiders, when a family isolates the black sheep, they are not describing reality. They are projecting. What they cannot tolerate in themselves, they cast onto the other. And so the enemy becomes a distorted reflection, carrying the very traits the self cannot admit. Jung called this the shadow, the unbearable content of the unconscious thrown onto the world, where it can be hated without guilt. I remember a woman who appeared saintly to everyone who knew her. She cared for her children, served her community, and never raised her voice. But she despised her sister. She called her selfish, arrogant, promiscuous. The hatred was so strong it consumed every conversation. Yet in her dreams, she was the selfish, the arrogant one, the one who broke boundaries in ways she never allowed herself to in waking life. Her sister was not the true enemy. Her sister was the projection of the self she could not accept. When she spoke of her sister's sins, she was, unknowingly, confessing her own. Modern psychology confirms this ancient insight. Studies on projection reveal that individuals consistently attribute their most repressed traits to others. A man who cannot face his aggression accuses others of hostility. A woman who denies her envy criticizes others as jealous. Neuroscientists have even identified this pattern in the brain. Repression of internal states correlates with heightened recognition of those same states in others. The more we deny within, the more without. This is why enemies are so seductive. They carry the weight of what we refuse to carry ourselves. Ancient traditions have always spoken of this. In Christian teaching, Christ warns, "Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but fail to see the plank in your own?" In Buddhist philosophy, anger toward another is described as the mirror of one's own attachment and aversion. In Greek myth, Narcissus cannot recognize his own reflection, seeing beauty as something separate from himself. In each story, the message is, what you hate outside is what you deny inside. The signs of projection unfold like scenes in a psychological thriller. The neighbor who insists everyone else gossips, yet whose own tongue never rests. The leader who accuses opponents of corruption, while his own accounts are hidden in shame. The parent who punishes a child for disobedience, while secretly resenting the obedience that has defined their entire life. Each accusation is not revelation, but confession. And if you learn to hear it, every enemy reveals the truth of the one who names them. The stages of projection move predictably. First, denial. The self refuses to see a trait within. Second, identification. The trait is perceived in others, often exaggerated. Third, demonization. The enemy becomes a vessel of evil, stripped of humanity. Fourth, persecution. The projected shadow is hunted, attacked, destroyed. And finally, emptiness. When the enemy is gone, the trait remains unhealed, demanding a new projection. This cycle repeats endless, because projection does not resolve the shadow. It multiplies. When entire societies project, the results are catastrophic. A nation that denies its greed accuses others of exploitation. A religion that denies its lust condemns outsiders for impurity. A political movement that denies its cruelty brands opponents as tyrants. Each time the projection creates enemies, justifying war, persecution, genocide. History's darkest moments are not simply acts of hatred, they are acts of projection, shadows painted onto others until blood was the only language left. The protocol of survival begins with brutal honesty. When you feel hatred rising against another, pause. What part of me lives in them? What am I refusing to see in myself? To admit this is not, it breaks the projection and weakens the hunger. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding. This is not poetic advice, survival strategy in a world addicted to enemies. But here lies the terrifying truth. Most will never do this. Most will choose projection over reflection, enemies over honesty, hatred over awareness. And so the cycle continues. Families torn apart, nations at war, civilizations collapsing under the weight of their own denied shadow. Remember this. The enemy you see most clearly may not be outside you at all. They may be the reflection of what you buried long ago staring back at you from the abyss. And until you face it, you will need enemies to survive, because without them, you would be forced to confront yourself. Imagine stripping a man of all his enemies. He has no rivals at work, no dissenters in his family, no shadows in his community. For a moment, you might think he would rejoice, but watch him closely. Soon his hands begin to shake, his eyes grow restless, his voice cracks as he asks questions he cannot answer. Who am I, if not the one who am I who resists? For many, identity is not built from the inside, it is constructed in opposition to. They do not exist themselves. They exist as the opposite of their enemy. I recall a patient whose life revolved around conflict. At his job, he always needed someone to undermine, someone to accuse of laziness or corruption. In his family, he positioned himself against siblings, competing for moral superiority. In politics, he raged against those with opposing views, not because he sought truth, but because without opposition, he felt erased. When, for a brief season, his life grew calm, he spiraled into depression. Peace did not soothe him. Peace felt like death. He confessed, "I don't know who I am without someone to fight." His words were chilling, because they revealed what Jung warned us of. Identity rooted in enmity is not identity at all. It is shadow dependency. Modern research confirms this disturbing pattern. Studies in social psychology reveal that group identity is strongest when there is a clear outgroup to oppose. Neuroscientists have shown that the same brain circuits that construct self-concept overlap with those activated when perceiving an enemy. In other words, the self literally borrows shape from the other. Without enemies, these circuits falter, leaving the person in existential crisis. This is why, historically, peace treaties rarely bring lasting peace. Nations quickly fracture inward, inventing new conflicts because their identity cannot sustain itself in opposition. Ancient wisdom told this story long before science. In Greek myth, Hector and Achilles define one another. Without Hector, Achilles his purpose. Without Achilles, Hector's name. In the Bible, Samson is meaningless without the Philistines, and David would be forgotten without Goliath. In Norse sagas, every god has an enemy, Loki, Fenrir, Jörmungandr, because the gods themselves cannot exist without war against chaos. Even in Eastern philosophy, the Tao acknowledges that light and dark, yin and yang, define one another. To deny the enemy is to deny the balance of existence. The warning signs of enemy-dependent identity are chilling. The father who constantly criticizes neighbors as though his own worth depends on proving them wrong. The activist who cannot rest even when their cause advances, immediately seeking a new battle. The religious leader who invents devils where none exist, because without them his sermons would fall silent. Each is a scene in the theater of possession, where the shadow demands conflict to feel alive. The stages of this dependency unfold like a descent into madness. First, self-definition through opposition. I am good because they are bad. Second, escalation. Every disagreement becomes war. Every rival becomes a threat. Third, hollow victory. When the enemy falls, the sense of self collapses. Fourth, desperate reinvention. A new enemy is created to restore the fragile identity. Finally, exhaustion. The endless cycle erodes the soul, leaving only bitterness where identity once stood. When multiplied across entire nations, the consequences are The Cold War did not end with peace. It left both superpowers searching for new enemies to stain their identities. Revolutions devour themselves when external foes vanish, turning inward with purges and betrayals. Religions fracture into endless schisms, each sect defining itself by who it condemns. This is not mere politics, it is archetypal truth. Without an enemy, a collective addicted to opposition collapses under its own emptiness. The protocol of survival demands a new foundation. Identity cannot be built on opposition. It must be built on awareness. Jung insisted that wholeness, not victory, is the path of the soul. To look inward and ask, "Who am I without enemies?" is terrifying because it forces the individual to meet themselves for the first time. Yet it is the only way to escape the addiction. Here is the terrible truth. Many people would rather live in war than confront the silence of self. They would rather invent enemies than stand before the abyss of their own emptiness. And so they fight and fight until the only thing that remains of them is the shadow. Remember this, the one who needs enemies to survive has already surrendered. They are no longer truly alive. They are only a reflection, a mask shaped by. To follow them is to inherit their emptiness. To resist them is to reclaim your own being. For the real battle is not with the enemy outside, it is with the void within. There is a terrifying truth that runs through history. When real enemies disappear, new ones are invented. Human beings who cannot exist without opposition will conjure adversaries out of thin air. They will twist neighbors into traitors, strangers into threats, and differences into crime. This is not madness. It is survival for those whose identities are bound. The manufactured enemy becomes the fuel that keeps their fragile sense of self burning. Without it, they would collapse into the abyss of meaninglessness. I recall a man who seemed ordinary in every way, diligent, respectful, yet he lived in constant fear of conspiracy. He believed his colleagues were plotting against him, his neighbors spreading rumors, even his own children secretly disobeying. No evidence supported these. He clung to them with desperation. In his unconscious, the enemy was necessary. Without it, he felt invisible, powerless, empty. His life was not a life of reality. It was a theater of paranoia. And in that theater, enemies had to exist, even if they had to be invented. Science reveals why this pattern is. Cognitive psychology shows that the human brain is wired to detect threats, even when none exist. Evolution favored those who imagined predators lurking in the shadows because false alarms were safer than fatal mistakes. But in modern life, this ancient circuitry mutates. The predator becomes the rival becomes the outsider, and suspicion becomes the lens through which life is lived. Neuroscientists have discovered that under chronic stress, the amygdala amplifies fear response, creating enemies from mere uncertainty. What was once survival in the wild has become a curse in the modern soul. Ancient wisdom described this same sickness. In Greek tragedy, Othello invents his enemy in Desdemona's imagined betrayal, and the lie destroys him. In Christian scripture, the Pharisees created enemies in Jesus and his followers, not because they were true threats, but because the Pharisees' power depended on opposition. In Hindu myth, the Asuras conjure endless battles against the gods, because without them, they cannot exist. Even the Norse tales warn that Loki, the trickster, thrives by manufacturing conflict, ensuring that the gods remain trapped in cycles. The warning signs of manufactured enemies are everywhere. The parent who accuses a child of rebellion, even in silence. The leader who insists that invisible conspiracies surround the community. The partner who invents betrayal in every glance or delay. These are not acts of paranoia alone. They are symptoms of an identity addicted to. The enemy must exist, because without it, the mask of goodness and strength would fall apart. The stages of manufactured enmity unfold with grim regularity. First, unease. The silence of peace becomes intolerable. Second, suspicion. Ordinary events are twisted into signs of betrayal. Third, invention. Accusations take form, vague at first, then sharpened with conviction. Fourth, escalation. Entire communities are persuaded that enemies are real, that danger lurks everywhere. Fifth, destruction. Lives ruined, trust shattered, sometimes blood spilled, all to satisfy the hunger for enemies. When multiplied across societies, the consequences are catastrophic. The witch trials in Salem were born of manufactured enemies. Children turned into communal. The Red Scare of the 20th century destroyed countless lives on the basis of suspicion. Genocides across history have been fueled not by real threats, but by fabricated ones, entire groups declared dangerous to justify slaughter. These are not aberrations. They are the inevitable result of humanity's need for enemies when none exist. The survival protocol demands vigilance against manufactured foes. You must ask yourself, is this enemy real, or is it the reflection of my own fear? To admit that suspicion lives inside you is painful, but it is the only defense. Jung taught that projection makes the world our scapegoat. To resist, one must reclaim those projections, hold them, and face them directly. Only then can the endless cycle of invented enemies be broken. But the truth is grim. Most will not do this. Most will cling to their invented adversaries, because the thought of living without them is more unbearable than the thought of living in hatred. And so wars are fought over illusions, families torn apart by suspicion, lives consumed by shadows that never existed. Remember this, the enemy may not be real, but the destruction they cause always is. Manufactured enemies burn just as hot as real ones, leaving scars on souls and nations alike. The only question is whether you will join the theater of paranoia or have the courage to see that the greatest enemy may be the fear within you, inventing ghosts to avoid silence. Hatred does not remain still. Once awakened, it grows, it multiplies, it consumes. Like a fire starved for oxygen, it spreads to every corner of the psyche, igniting spaces that once seemed safe. The need for an enemy begins with whispers, with unease, with suspicion. But soon it escalates, turning disagreements into wars, neighbors into threats, and strangers into monsters. Hatred, once allowed to live unchecked, evolves with terrifying predictability. I once counseled a man who began with minor grievances. At first, he spoke only of politics, those people, their corruption, their lies. But over time, his language sharpened, his voice cracked with venom. He began to despise his colleagues, then his own family, until even his son's smallest acts of defiance became proof of betrayal. His hatred no longer needed logic. It fed on itself, escalating beyond control. One night, he dreamt of fire, not just flames in a house or city, but fire that consumed the whole earth. When he described it, his eyes gleamed with fear, with hunger. He needed destruction to feel alive. Modern science explains this escalation with brutal clarity. Neurological studies show that repeated activation of anger circuits strengthens them like muscles trained in a gym. The more we indulge in hatred, the easier it becomes. Dopamine release during acts of aggression creates reinforcement. Hatred feels good, rewarding the brain like a drug. Psychologists call this the hostility loop, where hatred, once initiated, escalates until it defines the individual's identity. What began as a simple opposition evolves into addiction. The person no longer merely needs an enemy, they crave one. Ancient wisdom described the same spiral. In Christian scripture, Cain's resentment escalated into murder, though no true threat existed. In Greek tragedy, Medea's wounded pride grew into rage so consuming she killed her own children. In Norse myth, the trickster Loki's bitterness escalated until it unleashed Ragnarok, the destruction of gods and men alike. Hatred never remains where it begins. Once born, it always seeks escalation, always demands more. The signs of escalation are unmistakable. A friend who once debated calmly now trembles with fury at small disagreements. A leader whose speeches once sought unity now thrives on division. A spouse who once forgave begins to tally every fault, storing grievances like weapons. These are not ordinary irritations. They are signals of a psyche possessed, a soul sliding deeper into the abyss of enmity. Each escalation is a rehearsal for violence yet to come. The stages move with grim inevitability. First, irritation, small frustrations amplified into resentment. Second, obsession. The enemy dominates thought, appearing in every conversation, every dream. Third, dehumanization. The opponent becomes less than human, stripped of empathy, painted as monster. Fourth, aggression. Verbal attacks, sabotage, physical violence. Fifth, destruction. The hatred consumes not only the enemy, but the one who holds it, leaving only ruins in its wake. When this escalation infects entire groups, catastrophe follows. Communities once united splinter into factions, each demonizing the other. Nations descend into civil war, not because threats are real, but because hatred has escalated beyond logic. Genocides are never born fully formed. They begin with whispers, escalate with rhetoric, and end in blood. The 20th century alone offers endless proof. Neighbors turning against neighbors, cities set ablaze, millions slaughtered, all because hatred once tolerated became unstoppable. The survival protocol is vigilance. One must learn to recognize the escalation at its earliest stage before resentment matures into violence. When irritation becomes obsession, when disagreements turn to venom, when speech dehumanizes, you must act, withdraw. Confront the hatred within yourself before it infects your life. Jung taught that what we refuse to face in the unconscious grows stronger until it erupts in projection. To admit your capacity for hatred is to weaken its control. To deny it is to guarantee its escalation. But here lies the horror. Most people do not resist. They feed their hatred with gossip, with accusations, with endless argument. They mistake the rush of aggression for vitality, the clarity of enmity for truth. And so they escalate step by step until they no longer remember who they were before the fire. Remember this: hatred never sleeps. It waits, it grows, it escalates. And once unleashed, it does not merely destroy enemies, it consumes the very soul that summoned it, leaving behind ashes where once there was a human being. Violence rarely begins with fists or fire. It begins in silence, in thoughts whispered to oneself in the dark. It begins in the quiet rehearsals of hatred, in the fantasies of victory over an enemy. But once those whispers are given voice, and once those fantasies find action, violence is not easily contained. It moves in cycles, devouring generation after generation. One person's enemy becomes a family's curse, a community's obsession, a nation's war. The enemy outlives the individual because hatred, once passed down, becomes heritage. I once listened to the story of a man who had never met his grandfather, yet lived his entire life in the shadow of the man's. The grandfather had been betrayed in war, his property stolen, his name tarnished. Though he was long dead, his hatred lived on, and his children raised their own children on stories of vengeance, speaking of neighbors as traitors, of rival families. My patient had never seen those, yet he despised them with inherited passion. Hatred had become blood, and the enemy was not a person, it was a cycle, endlessly reborn. Science affirms this grim inheritance. Trauma studies reveal that unprocessed hatred and violence leave marks not only in the psyche, but in the body. Epigenetics shows that stress, fear, and aggression can alter gene expression, transmitting vulnerability to future generations. The cycle of violence is not metaphorical, it is biological. Neuroscience explains why children raised in hatred repeat the same scripts. Their brains are wired in early years to expect enemies, to prepare for conflict, to crave opposition. The enemy becomes destiny, inscribed in their very nervous systems. Ancient traditions warned of this curse. In the Bible, sins are said to be visited upon the children to the third and fourth generation. Greek tragedy is built upon inherited blood feud, as in the Oresteia, where one murder breeds another until an entire family line is soaked in blood. In Norse sagas, vendettas stretch across centuries, gods and mortals alike trapped in endless chains of vengeance. Even Buddhism describes samsara as the cycle of suffering reborn, fueled by ignorance, hatred, and desire. The cycle of violence is not simply history, it is archetype. The signs of this cycle can be seen in daily life. The child who mimics the father's suspicion, glaring at strangers, the daughter who inherits her mother's bitterness, distrusting families she has never met, the community that teaches its young to chant old grievances as though they were sacred hymns. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms of possession, the shadow moving across time. Each repetition tightens the grip, ensuring that the cycle will continue until someone dares to. The stages unfold predictably. First, injury, real or perceived, plants the seed of enmity. Second, inheritance. The story of the injury is passed down, shaping new minds. Third, escalation. Old wounds are revived, amplified, exaggerated. Fourth, eruption. violence reborn in the new generation, finally perpetuation. The cycle repeats, carried forward as if it were destined. At each stage, the shadow strengthens, feeding on memory, rumor. When entire nations inherit these cycles, history collapses under their weight. The Balkan Wars reignited centuries-old grievances. The Middle East bleeds not only from present wounds, but from ancestral enmities carried like sacred relics. Civil wars leave scars that resurface decades later, ensuring that peace is only ever temporary. These are not isolated conflicts. They are the cycle of violence written across humanity, repeated because no one dares to the original. The protocol of survival requires an act as terrifying as it is rare, breaking the chain. To look into the mirror of history and say, it ends with. This means confronting the inherited shadow, acknowledging the hatred without indulging it, and refusing to pass it forward. It requires consciousness fierce enough to endure the silence that follows when enemies no longer define you. Jung believed that individuation, the integration of shadow, was the only way to break such cycles. Without it, the wheel spins forever, grinding generations into dust. But the truth is this: most will not break it. Most will pass hatred to their children, calling it wisdom, identity, or tradition. And so the enemy survives long after the original wound has been feeding on memory until it becomes Remember this: violence is not a single act. It is and unless someone dares to step out of it, the shadow will ensure that enemies live forever, not because they are real, but because we keep them alive. There is a strange intoxication that descends upon a crowd. Alone, a person may hesitate, may doubt, may wrestle with conscience, but in the mass, something ancient awakens. The individual dissolves, and the crowd becomes a single organism, pulsing with one desire: to destroy the enemy. The transformation is frightening to witness, for it reveals how thin the veil of individuality truly is. Behind the mask of reason and civility, human beings long to merge into collective possession, to lose themselves in hatred shared with many. The enemy, once personal, becomes communal, and with that, all restraint vanishes. I once read the testimony of a man who marched in a rally that later erupted into violence. He confessed that he had no plan to attack, no hatred sharp enough to act on his own, but when thousands around him shouted the same slogans, raised the same fists, something took hold of him. He described it as an energy that surged through his body, a fire that erased his doubts. He struck strangers, burned property, screamed words he had never spoken in private. Afterward, in silence, he asked himself, who was I in? The answer was chilling. He was not himself. He was the crowd's shadow, moving as one with thousands who also believed they were righteous. Modern science calls this phenomenon de-individuation. Psychologists like Philip Zimbardo documented how anonymity and group identity dissolve moral boundaries, allowing ordinary people to commit atrocities they would never imagine alone. Neuroscience shows that mirror neurons synchronize emotions across crowds, making fear, rage, or euphoria contagious. Once the group identifies an enemy, the brain's empathy circuits shut down. In that moment, cruelty no longer feels like cruelty, it feels like duty. Ancient wisdom described this long before laboratories. In the Bible, mobs demanded crucifixion, shouting as one voice until reason was drowned. In Greek tragedy, the chorus often embodied the crowd, amplifying fear and hatred until catastrophe unfolded. Norse sagas spoke of berserkers, warriors who lost individuality in battle frenzy, possessed by collective rage. Even Buddhism warns of the delusion of the masses, Maya multiplied, where ignorance shared becomes truth. The crowd has always been seen as both intoxicating and dangerous because it is the place where shadow thrives unchecked. The signs of collective possession are easy to miss until it is too late. The cheer that grows too loud, the chant that repeats too often, the silence of dissent, swallowed by fear of the majority, the leader who frames enemies not as individuals, but as symbols of corruption, decay, or evil. Each scene feels theatrical, but its consequences are real. The crowd transforms suspicion into certainty, resentment into violence, belief into bloodshed. the stages unfold with precision. First, unity, the comfort of belonging, of merging into something larger than oneself. Second, identification, the crowd selects its enemy, giving the mass a shared purpose. Third, intoxication, fear and rage surge, each amplified by the many voices around you. Fourth, eruption, the enemy is attacked, scapegoat sacrificed, violence unleashed. Fifth, collapse, the crowd disperses. Individuals return home, stunned at what they have done, whispering excuses like, "It wasn't me," or "I didn't know what came over me." Yet the damage remains, carved into history. When magnified to nations, this possession becomes apocalyptic. Revolutions consume innocents. Pogroms erupt in villages, where neighbors become killers overnight. Genocides unfold in silence, broken only by chants, drums, speeches, and gunfire. The shadow, once denied in individuals, becomes sovereign in the crowd. Jung warned that such psychic epidemics were the greatest threat to humanity, far greater than natural disaster or physical disease. For when the crowd hunts enemies, the soul of civilization itself is devoured. The protocol of survival demands ruthless vigilance. Do not trust the intoxication of the crowd. When voices chant in unison, ask whose shadow they are carrying. When leaders promise purity through the destruction of enemies, retreat. Consciousness must remain solitary, even when surrounded. Jung believed the salvation of mankind lay in the integrity of individuals who refused to dissolve into the group. To resist the enemy within the crowd is lonely, but it is the only true courage. Here is the haunting truth. The crowd always believes it acts for good. It never sees itself as monstrous. Yet history proves again and again that the greatest crimes were committed not by isolated villains, but by thousands of ordinary people convinced they were righteous. If you want to know where the enemy hides, do not only look across the border or at the rival family. Look into the chanting crowd and you will see the shadow standing tall, smiling through 1,000 borrowed faces. If you want to control a people, you do not give them bread or freedom. You give them enemies. Fear, more than hunger or poverty, binds the masses together. Leaders have always known this. An enemy unites, distracts, and legitimizes power. Without enemies, rulers risk exposure. Their flaws shine, their promises unravel, their control weakens. But with an enemy, real or imagined, they become indispensable. They offer protection, guidance, survival. The politics of fear is the oldest and most effective form of governance because it feeds not on reason, but on shadow. I once spoke with a man who grew up under a regime where propaganda was daily bread. From childhood, he was told who the enemy was. Posters in the streets depicted grotesque caricatures. Schools repeated chants of hatred. And even in his own home, the air was thick with suspicion. He confessed that he never questioned it. The fear felt real, the enemy undeniable. Only later, when the regime collapsed, did he realize that most of those enemies had never threatened him at all. Yet the damage was permanent. He admitted he still could not shake the reflex to distrust, to divide, to fear. His psyche had been forged in the politics of enemies. Science confirms how deeply fear manipulates the brain. The amygdala, the center of threat detection, responds faster than conscious. Studies at Stanford and MIT show how fear overrides rational processing, creating knee-jerk reactions, hostility. Politicians exploit this wiring by amplifying threats, real or fabricated, ensuring loyalty through survival instinct. Neuroscience has given language to what tyrants have always practiced. Fear turns people into obedient shadows of themselves, willing to follow anyone who promises safety from the enemy. The ancients told these stories long before psyche. In Roman times, emperors maintained power by pointing to barbarians, even when those barbarians posed no immediate danger. In biblical texts, kings blamed foreign idols for their people's suffering, fueling wars in the name of protection. In Norse sagas, leaders warned of giants and monsters to justify endless cycles of violence. The pattern never changes. To rule effectively, you must convince people that without you, the enemy will destroy them. The warning signs are everywhere in modern life. Speeches heavy with words like threat, corruption, traitor. News cycles that amplify danger more than hope. families and communities divided by fear of the outsider, fear of betrayal, fear of collapse. These fears often lack substance, but they do not need substance. They need only repetition. Fear repeated enough times becomes indistinguishable from truth. The stages of the politics of fear are methodical. First, identification. A vague threat is introduced, shaping unease. Second, amplification. The enemy is described in detail, made monstrous. Third, polarization. The people are divided into loyalists and traitors, with no middle ground. Fourth, mobilization. Violence, surveillance, or suppression is justified as defense. Finally, dependency. The people cannot imagine life without protection from the enemy, and the leader becomes irreplaceable. Each stage tightens the chain until freedom becomes unthinkable. When entire nations live under this, history turns nightmare. Totalitarian regimes survive not by offering prosperity, by offering enemies. Revolutions devour themselves as leaders fabricate traitors within their own ranks to justify terror. Democracies, too, collapse when fear eclipses reason, when leaders convince citizens that survival demands absolute obedience. Humanity willingly enslaves itself to shadow because the alternative, facing life without an enemy, is too unbearable. The protocol of survival requires piercing the illusion. When leaders speak of enemies, ask, what are they hiding? What fear are they feeding? To resist fear is to reclaim your soul. Jung insisted that consciousness must expose projections, stripping them of their power. To refuse the politics of fear is not easy, for it means embracing uncertainty, ambiguity, and vulnerability. But it is the only path to freedom. Here is the final warning. The politics of fear will always return. There will always be voices promising safety in exchange for enemies, and most will accept because the promise is seductive, because the shadow within craves direction. But if you choose awareness, you can see through the manipulation. You can refuse to drink from the cup of fear. Remember this, fear is the oldest currency of power, and enemies are its counterfeit bills. Do not spend your soul on them. For the moment you accept an enemy without question, you are no longer free. You are already possessed. What happens when the enemy disappears? For most, peace is a blessing. But for those whose identities are built entirely on opposition, peace is unbearable. When the war ends, when the rival surrenders, when the scapegoat is gone, they face a silence more frightening than death. In that silence, they encounter themselves and often discover that without an enemy, there is nothing left. The collapse is swift, brutal, and almost always destructive. I once treated a retired soldier who had lived through multiple wars. For decades, his existence was defined by the enemy. Uniforms, missions, victories, losses. When the fighting stopped, his soul unraveled. He became restless, irritable, haunted by dreams of battlefields he no longer belonged to. Without an enemy, he turned inward, manufacturing conflict, accusing his family of betrayal, even sabotaging his own peace. He confessed, I don't know who I am if I'm not fighting. His collapse was not physical, but existential. He could not survive the void left by the absence of enemies. Modern science has a name for this, post-conflict identity crisis. Veterans, revolutionaries, even activists often experience depression, addiction, or violence once their cause ends. Neuroscientists explain it as a collapse of neural pathways conditioned for hostility and vigilance. The brain, addicted to the chemistry of conflict, suffers withdrawal when enemies disappear. Psychologists call it existential disorientation, the terrifying realization that one's life has meaning only in opposition. Without conflict, the self dissolves into despair. Ancient wisdom told these stories long before science. In the Bible, the Israelites, once freed from Egypt, wandered aimlessly in the desert, turning against one another because they no longer had Pharaoh as an enemy. In Greek epics, warriors like Odysseus and Achilles struggled to return to ordinary life, their souls unable to rest without combat. In Norse myth, the gods, after victories, always awaited new enemies, for without them, even the gods lost purpose. The archetype is eternal. When the enemy disappears, collapse follows. The warning signs of this collapse appear in subtle ways. the activist who grows bitter when their cause succeeds, the partner who picks fights in moments of calm, the leader who sabotages peace agreements because ruling without conflict terrifies. Each reveals the same truth. The absence of enemies is a mirror they cannot bear to face, for in that mirror they see not their strength, but their emptiness. The stages of collapse move like shadows at dusk. First, unease. The silence of peace feels alien. Second, agitation. Conflict is manufactured in trivial places. Third, disintegration. Identity fractures, depression, or paranoia takes hold. Fourth, self-destruction. Addictions, violence, or suicide emerge. Finally, contagion. The collapse spreads to those around them, pulling others back into cycles of enmity just to restore meaning. The shadow, once fed by enemies, now feeds on the soul itself. When this collapse occurs collectively, history trembles. Nations that defeat their enemies often splinter into civil wars. Revolutions, once victorious, consume their own children in purges. Empires, once triumphant, implode under internal suspicion. Peace does not last because collective identity cannot survive without conflict. Humanity proves again and again that it does not know how to live without enemies, and so it chooses collapse over silence, war over emptiness. The protocol of survival demands preparation for peace. You must cultivate identity, not from opposition, but from wholeness. To ask yourself, who am I when no one is against me, is the most dangerous question, but also the most liberating. Jung believed individuation, embracing both light and shadow, was the antidote to collapse. Without enemies, you must become your own confrontation, your own battlefield, your own resolution. But the grim truth remains. Most will not do. Most will sabotage peace to avoid the terror of silence. Most will invent new enemies rather than endure the abyss of self. And so the cycle repeats. Wars end, enemies fall, and yet conflict is reborn because humanity cannot bear to live without opposition. Remember this, the collapse without enemies is more dangerous than the war itself. For in that collapse, men and nations alike reveal that their greatest fear was never the enemy outside. It was the emptiness within. In the end, all enemies disappear. Nations fall, revolutions die, families dissolve, rivals fade into dust. But the hunger for enemies does not vanish with them. It turns inward. The last enemy is not the stranger across the border, nor the rival in the workplace, nor the heretic in the temple. The last enemy is the self. And this is the most terrifying truth of all, that the war humanity wages outside is only a reflection of the war within. When the external foe is gone, the shadow has no choice but to confront its hope. I once sat with a woman whose entire life had been defined by opposition. She fought her parents, her lovers, her employers, her governments. When old age stripped her of strength and conflict, she found herself alone. But peace did not come. Instead, she turned against herself. She whispered curses in the mirror, struck her own face in the night, refused food and warmth as punishment. She had spent her life surviving through enemies, and when none remained, she became her own battle. Her body bore the scars of wars fought within. In her final days, she admitted in tears, "I don't know how to live without hatred." Science confirms this final confrontation. Depression, self-harm, and suicide often surge when external conflicts fade. Psychologists describe this as internalized hostility, the projection turned inward. The enemy that once gave structure to life becomes the self that must be destroyed. Neuroscientists observe that the same brain regions activated in outward aggression ignite in self-destructive behavior. Hatred, once externalized, always seeks a host. When no enemy remains, the self becomes its prey. The ancients warned of this end. In Christian scripture, Judas turns his aggression inward, betraying himself after betraying his master. In Greek myth, Ajax falls on his own sword when robbed of enemies. In Norse legend, Odin foresees his own death, for even the gods cannot escape the enemy. In Buddhism, the cycle of samsara ends only when one recognizes that the true struggle is not with others, but with the delusions of the self. Across every tradition, the final enemy is always the same, the shadow staring back from the abyss. The signs of this confrontation are chilling. The activist who turns bitter against them when their cause, the warrior who, after victory, drinks themselves into oblivion, the leader who, once abandoned by enemies, rots in paranoia, suspecting betrayal from within their own soul. Each is a reflection of the same path. The final war is not fought with weapons, but with mirrors. The stages of the final enemy unfold with dreadful clarity. First, silence. The absence of conflict feels unbearable. Second, implosion. The hostility, once cast outward, rebounds inward. Third, fragmentation. The psyche splits, one part accusing, the other defending, until both collapse. Fourth, destruction. The self devours itself. Despair, addiction, or death. Fifth, revelation. Consciousness awakens in time, the truth emerges. The enemy was never outside. It was always within. When entire societies reach this point, civilizations collapse. Rome rotted from within, once external foes were subdued. Empires, having conquered the world, consumed themselves in decadence and suspicion. Nations without external wars implode into civil strife, devouring their own citizens. History repeats the same warning. When enemies are gone, humanity's shadow turns inward, and without consciousness, it destroys it. The survival protocol in this final confrontation is perhaps the most brutal. You must embrace the enemy within before it consumes you. To name your hatred, your envy, your rage, not as sins to be repressed, nor as virtues to be flaunted, but as truths to be integrated. Jung called this individuation the reconciliation of light and shadow, the acceptance of wholeness. Only then can the cycle of enemies be broken. Without it, the shadow will always demand another victim, and when no one else is left, it will be you. Here is the final terrifying truth. People do not need enemies to survive. They believe they do because they are afraid to face themselves. The external enemy is a distraction from the abyss within. But the abyss never disappears. It waits, patient, silent, inevitable. And if you do not face it consciously, it will consume you unconsciously. So listen carefully. The last enemy is not your rival, your neighbor, your nation's foe. The last enemy is you. And the one who dares to look into that abyss, to embrace it without fear, is the one who survived. For in the end, the war was never out. It was always here, in the silence of your own soul.